Imagine standing in the middle of St. Mark's Square during a winter flood. The water rises slowly around your boots, cold and dark, creeping up the ancient marble steps of the basilica as if the sea itself is reclaiming what was always hers. The pigeons have vanished, the tourists have fled, and you are left standing on a city that, by every law of physics and engineering, should not exist. Beneath your feet, not concrete, not bedrock, not solid earth, is a prehistoric forest. Millions of wooden stakes driven into the mud centuries ago by fishermen, refugees, and monks who had no engineering degree, no computer models, no reinforced steel. Just rope, desperation, and a genius that history almost forgot. Venice shouldn't work. And yet, for over 1,000 years it has. So what is really holding it up? The answer is stranger, more beautiful, and more terrifying than you might think. The story of Venice does not begin with architects or emperors. It begins with panic. In the 5th and 6th centuries AD, barbarian waves rolled across northern Italy like a slow, catastrophic tide. The Huns, the Visigoths, the Lombards, one after another, they swept through the cities of the mainland, burning, conquering, displacing entire civilizations. The people who fled did not have the luxury of choosing good land. They ran toward the water. They ran toward the lagoon. What they found there was barely land at all. The Venetian lagoon is a flat, brackish, shifting world, neither fully sea nor fully earth. A maze of marshy islands, tidal channels, and mudflats so soft that, as ancient chroniclers recorded, a man who stepped onto them would sink to his waist. There were no trees tall enough to build with growing there. There was no stone beneath the surface. There was only mud, water, salt, and fear. And somehow from that, they built a civilization. The very first Venetians did not build. They floated. They lived on rafts, on reed huts, on stilts, moving with the tides like aquatic nomads. But survival has a way of forcing innovation, and slowly, generation by generation, these frightened refugees became the most sophisticated urban engineers the medieval world had ever seen. The genius began underground, or rather, beneath the underground. Beneath the mud of the Venetian lagoon lies a layer of particularly dense, compressed clay. A geological accident that would become the salvation of a city. The Venetians discovered, through centuries of trial and desperate error, that if you drove a wooden stake deep enough, past the soft mud, past the silt, all the way down into that compressed clay, something remarkable happened. The stake stopped. It held. And if you sealed it from air, if you kept it permanently submerged, it did not rot. It turned to stone. The early Venetians did not know the chemistry, but they understood the result. And so, they drove stakes, millions upon millions of stakes. Historians estimate that beneath the city of Venice today lie more than 10 million wooden piles. The wood came from forests across Slovenia, Croatia, and the eastern shores of the Adriatic. Entire ancient woodlands felled, stripped, and transported across the sea. The logs were typically alder and oak, chosen for their density and resilience. They were driven into the ground by hand, using primitive pile drivers, heavy weights hoisted up and dropped again and again in a thunderous, repetitive rhythm that must have echoed across the lagoon for centuries. Each pile measured between 10 and 25 centimeters in diameter and drove between 1 and 3.5 meters into the clay below. Builders packed them in at approximately 9 piles per square meter, a density so extreme that the invisible forest beneath the city became, in effect, a single continuous platform of compressed wood. And those stakes are still there, right now. Beneath the Rialto Bridge, beneath the Doge's palace, beneath the foundations of 1,000 palaces and churches and humble homes, that ancient submerged forest stands as it has stood for centuries, hardened to something approaching stone, holding everything up with a silence so complete you could almost forget it exists. Above the piles came the platforms. The Venetians laid thick wooden beams across the tops of their stakes, creating a kind of raft, a floating base that distributed the weight of the structures above across the entire field of piles below. This was the second layer of their extraordinary engineering system, and it solved a problem that haunts builders to this day: uneven settling. But wood, even petrified wood, has limits. Above the wooden platforms, the Venetians added another layer: stone. Specifically, Istrian stone, a dense white limestone quarried from the Istrian Peninsula across the Adriatic. This material became the building block of Venice's identity. It is exceptionally hard. It is highly resistant to the erosive effects of salt water and salt air. And it has an almost magical ability to resist the freeze-thaw cycles that destroy other stones in wetter climates. The Venetians used it for their foundations, their bridge footings, their doorways and thresholds. Anywhere the contact between structure and environment was most severe. Above the Istrian stone came brick. The choice of brick over stone for the main bodies of buildings was not aesthetic. It was engineering. Brick is lighter than stone. A lighter building places less stress on the foundations below. And in a city where every kilogram matters, where the ground itself is held up by nothing but ancient wood and compressed mud, saving weight was an obsession. Venetian bricks were also fired to unusually high temperatures, creating a harder, denser product that resisted moisture penetration. The result was a layered system of extraordinary elegance: wooden piles in the clay, wooden platforms atop the piles, Istrian stone above the platforms, brick above the stone, and then, soaring upward into the light, the marble and mosaic and gilded glory of the city that the world actually sees. Most of Venice is hidden. The part you see is almost incidental. There is something else buried beneath Venice that most visitors never think about: freshwater. In the middle of a saltwater lagoon, surrounded by the sea on all sides, the city had clean, fresh drinking water. Not imported, not transported at great cost from the mainland, but collected right there, from the sky. The Venetians built thousands of underground cisterns scattered across the city's 118 islands. Each was a marvel of passive engineering. A clay-lined pit with a central porous stone shaft filled between with fine sand. When rain fell on the surrounding squares, the campi of Venice, it drained through the paving, seeped through the sand, filtered clean, and collected in the shaft from which it could be drawn. But Venice was never just a solution to an engineering problem. It was an empire. By the 11th century, the city that had begun as a collection of mud island refugees had become the commercial crossroads of the known world. Salt, spices, silk, glass. Venetian merchants controlled the trade routes connecting east and west. At its height, the Venetian Republic commanded more than 3,000 ships and maintained ports across the entire Mediterranean. It was not a city. It was a maritime civilization, a floating empire anchored to the mud of a lagoon by the wisdom of its invisible forest below. The buildings that rose from that foundation reflected the same paradoxical genius. Venetian Gothic architecture looks impossible. Palaces with paper-thin walls of carved stone, perforated by enormous windows, soaring upward on a foundation of petrified wood in a city of tidal channels. It defies logic at every turn. The architects understood that the lighter they could make the upper structures, the less stress they would place on the foundations. So they hollowed out their walls. They replaced solid stone with lacework. They turned windows into entire walls of tracery and glass. In Venice, architecture became a study in the art of weight reduction. Venice has no basements, no underground floors. The ground level of a Venetian building is considered sacrificial, regularly flooded, regularly cleaned, essentially a buffer zone between the always threatening water below and the inhabited spaces above. Venetian families have traditionally lived on the second floor and higher, a habit born of centuries of accommodation with the sea. And beneath the narrow alleys and the aging palazzos, archaeologists have found traces of even older infrastructure: clay pipes from the Roman era, drainage channels predating the city itself. In 2020, a team of underwater researchers discovered something that stopped them cold: the remnants of a Roman road submerged beneath the lagoon floor. A paved road, leading nowhere visible now, or rather, leading to a shoreline that no longer exists, from a time before the sea had risen to its current level, from a world in which this place was dry land. Venice is not just built on water, it is built on time itself. For centuries, that time moved slowly enough to be managed. The city sank, as all cities do, under the weight of its own ambition. But it sank slowly, millimeters per year, and the tides rose slowly, and the engineers and stonemasons kept pace. Then came the industrial age, which pumped groundwater from beneath the lagoon and caused the city to sink faster, sometimes as much as 5 millimeters per year in the mid-20th century, before the pumping was stopped and the sinking slowed. But now, the threats are accelerating faster than any medieval engineer could have imagined. The sea is rising. Not the casual, everyday rise and fall of tides, but the long, slow, irreversible rise of climate change. Venice is currently sinking at approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year. That number sounds almost negligible until you understand that even that small figure, compounded over decades against a rising sea, transforms Acqua Alta from an inconvenience into an existential threat. Acqua Alta, high water, has always been part of Venetian life. The city has flooded regularly since its founding, and its people developed a culture of accommodation: raised doorsteps, rubber boots, elevated walkways deployed on winter mornings when the siren sounded. But the floods are getting higher. The flood of November 2019 reached 187 centimeters above sea level, the highest recorded in half a century, exceeded only by the catastrophic event of 1966 that swept away irreplaceable artworks and came within inches of destroying the city permanently. The response to that 1966 flood took nearly 4 decades to move from concept to construction. In 2003, Italy began work on the MOSE system, Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, a vast network of 78 hinged metal gates installed at the 3 inlets connecting the Venetian lagoon to the Adriatic Sea. When high tides are forecast, compressed air is pumped into the hollow gates, causing them to rise from their concrete housings on the sea floor and seal the lagoon against the incoming water. The project was massively over budget, ballooning from 2 billion euros to more than 7 billion. It was plagued by corruption scandals, and critics argued it addressed only the symptom: immediate flooding, not the deeper causes. The sinking, the rising sea, the damage done by mass tourism and cruise ship wakes, the commercial pressure slowly hollowing out the living city even as the monuments are preserved. But in November 2020, when a massive storm surge threatened to crest the city's highest foundations, MOSE was activated for the first time, and it worked. The gates rose, the water was held back. Venice stayed dry. Beneath the lagoon, that wall of steel now stands as the latest, most technologically sophisticated layer in a foundation system that began with wooden stakes driven into mud by refugees 1,500 years ago. It is the newest stratum in a geological record of human ingenuity. Prehistoric clay, Roman roads, petrified forests, Istrian stone, medieval brick, and now aerospace-grade stainless steel. Each layer representing a civilization's answer to the same fundamental challenge. How do you hold up something that has no right to stand? Today, for the first time in the city's history, the answer also involves satellites and sonar. Teams of scientists are using underwater drones to map every centimeter of Venice's submerged foundations, identifying cracks, voids, and structural weakness in real time. Laser scanning technology creates three-dimensional models of the city's buildings with unprecedented precision. Satellite systems track the movement of the city's surface to a fraction of a millimeter, detecting subtle patterns of settling that would have been invisible to any previous generation. What they are finding is simultaneously reassuring and alarming. The ancient foundations, the petrified wooden piles, the Istrian stone platforms, the medieval brickwork, are in remarkable condition. The wood that was submerged has mineralized, just as the Venetians intended. It is hard, it is stable. It is, in many cases, in better condition than the concrete of buildings constructed 50 years ago. But the upper layers, the modern repairs, the 19th century restoration work, are failing. Portland cement, introduced in Venetian restoration in the late 19th century, does not breathe the way the original lime mortars did. It traps moisture, it cracks, it corrodes the iron reinforcement bars added to strengthen weakened structures, and as those bars rust and expand, they split the ancient stone from within. The buildings are not being destroyed by water from outside. They are being destroyed by the well-intentioned repairs inserted into them from within. This is perhaps the most humbling discovery that modern science has made about Venice. The ancient system worked because it was designed as a unified whole. Wood that mineralizes in water, stone that resists salt, mortar that breathes and flexes, bricks light enough to minimize foundation stress. When you introduce foreign elements, you disrupt a system that had achieved equilibrium over centuries. And so, in laboratories in Rome and Florence and Venice itself, scientists are working to reconstruct the original mortars, the exact mix of lime and seawater that hardened in ways modern materials cannot match. They are testing traditional brick compositions, traditional stone repair techniques, traditional methods of pile assessment. They are, in short, trying to learn from the people who built a city on mud. Those people, the fishermen and monks and refugees who drove the first stakes into the lagoon floor, knew something we are only beginning to rediscover. They knew that you cannot fight the environment you build in. You must understand it so completely that you can make it an ally. The water that should destroy the wooden piles instead preserves them. The salt air that corrodes most stones polishes and hardens the Istrian limestone. The tides that flood the city also flush its canals clean. Every element of the Venetian environment that seems like a threat is, in the hands of a builder who truly understands it, a resource. This is the deepest secret of Venice. Not the 10 million wooden piles, not the Meuse flood barriers, not the satellites or the drones. The secret is the mindset of its builders. They did not build Venice despite the water. They built Venice with the water. They looked at a swampy, shifting, impossible environment, and they did not see a problem to be overcome. They saw a set of materials, mud, water, wood, salt. And they asked, how do we make this work? And so, the next time you stand on the worn stones of a Venetian bridge, watching the green water move slowly beneath you in the early morning light, remember what lies below. Remember the forest of petrified wood, invisible and ancient, holding up the marble and the mosaics and the centuries above. Remember the Roman road beneath the lagoon floor, a trace of a world that existed before this one. Remember the medieval cisterns filtering rainwater the same way they have for 800 years. The most impressive thing about Venice is not what you can see. It is what you cannot see. The layers, the patience, the profound and stubborn refusal to accept that something cannot be done. Venice exists because people who had nothing, no safety, no certainty, no solid ground beneath their feet, looked at an impossible situation and decided to build anyway. Against all logic, against every law of engineering and geology and common sense, it held. It still holds. And if you think the story of impossible cities built on impossible foundations ends here. Think again. Beneath the streets of our greatest cities, beneath our oceans, and perhaps soon beneath the surfaces of other worlds, the same ancient questions are being asked. The same wisdom is being rediscovered. Because the challenge that faced the first Venetians, how do you build something permanent in a world that is constantly, relentlessly changing, is the challenge we all face now. Stay with us. The ground beneath the story has only just begun to tremble.